A client asked a really good question last week, and this is a nightmare situation for most parents. You and your spouse are out of town, and without your knowledge or consent, your teenage son or daughter decides to throw a party at your house. Minors are at the party, they're drinking, and another 16-year-old driving home from the party after having too much to drink causes a serious auto accident. You're now being sued by the parents of that 16-year-old and those that he injured in the auto accident. Do you have any insurance coverage in this situation? We're going to discuss that this week on How Insurance Works, coming up right now.
Welcome to the How Insurance Works podcast. The content in this podcast should not be considered insurance advice and is for general informational purposes only. Insurance forms and endorsements vary based on insurance company, changes in addition dates, regulations, court decisions, and state jurisdiction. So please consult your agent for further advice. And now back to How Insurance Works with Mike McGilvery.
Welcome to the How Insurance Works podcast. Thank you for tuning in. If we have not yet met here, my name is Mike McGilvery. I'm a second-generation licensed agent and broker at Shaw Moses Mendenhall and Associates in Southern California. My goal in the podcast is simple. It's to help educate and inform on various aspects of insurance, insurance coverage, and the insurance industry to help you make better informed decisions. I want you to imagine three different situations and think about if you've thought of any of these, or perhaps you know somebody that any of these situations apply to. First situation. We alluded to this earlier in the podcast. You and your spouse are out of town, and without your knowledge or consent, your teenage son or daughter throws a party at your house, minors are drinking at the party, and a 16-year-old leaves that party after having too much to drink and causes a very serious car accident. You're now being sued by the parents of that 16-year-old and by those that the 16-year-old injured in the car accident. Do we have any insurance coverage in this situation? Here's our second situation. You're at the dog park with your dog, and your dog accidentally bites a small child at the park. You're now being sued by the parents of that child. Is there any insurance coverage in that situation? And number three, you're having a small gathering at your home, and one of your more elderly guests who's arriving trips on a toy your child left on the walkway, falls, and hits their head hard on the concrete, severely injured. You're now being sued by that guest for medical costs and damages. Do we have any insurance in that situation? Well, all of these three situations and stories all relate to personal liability coverage, and that is what we're going to talk about in this podcast. We're going to talk about where to find personal liability coverage so you can determine whether or not you have it, what it covers you for, and then we're going to apply that to our three situations to see if our coverage might respond in those situations: the party, the dog bite, and the small gathering at your home. So where do we find personal liability coverage in any of our policies, and do you have it? Well, here's the good news. If you have a homeowner's policy, a condo owner's policy, or a renter's policy, you already have personal liability coverage. It's a standard coverage in all of those policies, and where you can find it is under Coverage E in your liability coverage. Now, as always, we're going to show a video of this podcast on howinsuranceworks.co, and in that video, we're going to show you some examples of a personal homeowner's policy, a condo owner's policy, and a renter's policy, so you can see what the language looks like where it says Coverage E personal liability. If you want to check out that video, just go to howinsuranceworks.co. So what does personal liability cover us for? Well, this is the coverage that responds if we're being sued for accidentally injuring someone or injuring somebody else's property. Now, this is always outside your car, because if we get sued for accidentally injuring somebody or damaging somebody's property in our car, that's going to be covered under our auto insurance. So personal liability is the coverage that responds if you're sued for accidentally injuring someone or damaging somebody else's property outside your car, but whether you're inside or outside your home. And personal liability coverage is usually written for $100,000, $300,000, or $500,000 in coverage. That's really standard. But you'll find it in Coverage E in your homeowner's, condo owner's, or renter's policy. So what exactly is this coverage paying for? What does this $100,000, $300,000, or $500,000 pay for? Well, if you're sued for accidentally injuring somebody, personal liability coverage is going to pay for that person's medical cost and whatever potential judgment a judge levies against you. You'll also have defense costs, and here's the nice thing about personal liability coverage. Obviously, if you're being sued, you're going to need an attorney, and attorneys cost money. So what about paying for your defense costs? Well, in most of today's insurance policies that use standard forms, and most of them do, your defense costs are actually included outside the limits of your personal liability coverage. So what this means is if you have $300,000 in personal liability coverage, that $300,000 is going to go to medical costs and the judgment. The defense costs are included in addition to that $300,000 in coverage, and the defense costs are paid for by the insurance company. So it's an important distinction. It didn't used to be that way. Your defense costs used to come out of your $300,000 limit. No longer does that in most standard insurance forms, in most standard insurance policies. The other nice thing about personal liability coverage, we know in this world anyone can sue anybody for anything. So if you are sued for accidentally injuring somebody or damaging their property, and maybe it's a fraudulent, groundless, or a baseless claim, well, your insurance company's still going to pay the legal cost to defend you as well. And we're going to show some policy language up on the screen in the video of this podcast on howinsuranceworks.co so you can see a little bit of that language. So we know that our personal liability coverage responds if we are sued for accidentally injuring someone or causing damage to somebody else's property, but there are some things it doesn't cover. Those are called exclusions in our policy, and I do want to talk about a few here for a second. Now, exclusions are just things that are not covered in the policy, and we're also going to show some of those exclusions on howinsuranceworks.co on the video of this podcast. But here are the few that I want to point out because they are relevant to the three situations we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. And number one, that's intentional acts. So if we intentionally injure someone, or if we intentionally cause damage to somebody else's property, our personal liability coverage is not going to cover us. It's not going to respond. So we can't do anything intentional. And number two are criminal acts. If we're engaged in an illegal act or activity and we injure somebody or damage somebody else's property, our coverage is not going to respond. And I want you to keep that in mind because that goes back to the story about the party. So let's look at these three situations and examine how our personal liability coverage might respond in the three situations we described at the beginning of the podcast. So the party, you and your spouse are out of town. Without your knowledge or consent, your teenage son or daughter throws a party. A 16-year-old leaving that party who's had too much to drink causes a serious accident. You're now being sued. So would your personal liability coverage respond? And this is likely going to depend on whether you had knowledge of the party or not. If you could prove that you really had no knowledge of the party, then yes, your personal liability coverage might respond depending on the policy and the policy language. This is a tricky situation because each state has their own social host liability laws that stipulate liability in different situations. Now, for this specific situation, I'm going to reference California. That's where I'm from. Why is it important whether you actually had knowledge of the party or not? I want you to think about one of those personal liability exclusions we just talked about, criminal acts. In California, it's illegal to serve alcohol to a minor. So even though you weren't home, if it's found out that you knew about the party and endorsed or supported it, it's likely that your personal liability coverage wouldn't respond due to the criminal acts exclusion. I know it's harsh to say criminal acts in this situation, but it is illegal in California to serve alcohol to a minor. Now, this would also be true in California if you were at the party and you knowingly served alcohol to a minor. That minor drove home, caused a serious accident that injured them and other people. If you're sued in that situation where you're actually serving the minor, your personal liability coverage is likely not going to respond, and that's going to be due to the criminal acts exclusion. But in our situation, in the beginning of the podcast, we mentioned that you didn't have any knowledge of the party and certainly didn't consent to it. Now, if you can prove that and make a good argument for that, it's likely your personal liability coverage may respond as long as there isn't any other specific exclusion in the policy preventing it from responding. Now, I do want to mention as a side note, this could be a very high-cost claim. We could be liable for the medical costs of all the parties involved in the accident, the 16-year-old, those that he injured, the property damage for all of the cars, any other property damage. So this could be much more than $100,000, $300,000, or $500,000. And understand, the attorney on the other side, they're not just going to probably sue you for the medical costs and the property damage. They very well might come after your entire net worth. It doesn't mean they're going to get it, but they can certainly try. This is why it might make sense to talk to your agent about a personal umbrella and personal umbrella coverage. We talked about that last week in our podcast. That was applicable to an auto accident, but I do want you to know that an umbrella will also provide extra coverage over your personal liability coverage in your homeowner's, condo owners, or renter's policy. An umbrella can give you $1 million or $2 million more in personal liability coverage. So if you have $300,000 right now, you buy $1 million umbrella, you now have $1.3 million in personal liability coverage. And umbrellas can be very cost effective. For $1 million right now in the market, you can get one for $300 to $600 per year. So something to talk to your agent about. An attorney once told me about a claim he was working on, similar situation, where teenagers threw a party at the house while their parents were away. The kids were jumping off the pool, or rather off the roof, into the pool. And one of the kids slipped off the roof, fell on the concrete, was paralyzed. So unfortunately, these things can happen. And this is another situation where it could be a very, very high cost claim, and you might want to look into a personal umbrella so that you have more than just the $300,000 or $500,000 or $100,000 in personal liability coverage. Now, how about our second situation? You're at the dog park and your dog accidentally bites a small child. You're now being sued by the parents of that small child. Well, this is a much more common claim. And the American Medical Association estimates there are 4.5 million dog bites per year. In 2018, according to the Insurance Information Institute, insurers paid out over $675 million in dog bite claims. So this is fairly common. And it's likely, yes, your personal liability coverage would respond in this situation. Remember, it covers you not only inside the home, but outside the home. Now, I do want to mention there are some breeds of dogs excluded in your personal liability coverage. Some of the most commonly excluded are Dobermans, Rottweilers, Pit Bulls, Chows, and German Shepherds. They're just more aggressive dogs and are more prone to biting. So check the exclusions in your personal liability coverage. Go over those with your agent because there are some breeds of dogs excluded. On the video of this podcast, we're going to show an example of some of the exclusions as they apply to dogs in an example personal liability, in an example homeowner's policy under the personal liability coverage. Now, how about the small gathering at your home? This is our third situation. So you have a more elderly guest that's walking up the walkway, and unfortunately, one of your children left a toy out in the walkway. They trip on that and they hit their head on the concrete and they are severely injured. In this situation, would our personal liability coverage respond? And the answer to this one is yes, it's very likely it would respond. This is one of the common claims as well, besides the dog bite claims. However, I do want to mention one exclusion. If you remember, we talked about exclusions in the beginning of the podcast, and that's the intentional acts exclusion. So as long as you don't intentionally leave something out on the walkway for someone to trip on, as long as you don't intentionally try to cause harm to somebody, then in this situation where your guest trips on that toy accidentally, falls on the sidewalk, hits their head on the concrete, that yes, your personal liability coverage would respond in that situation. Now, we've seen some other common claims too as well. If a tree in your yard falls on your neighbor's roof or on your neighbor's car, that would be covered under your personal liability coverage in most situations. If you live in a condo and your water heater leaks and it causes water damage in the condo unit next to you, that would be covered under your personal liability coverage. So a lot of different situations there. To summarize this podcast under personal liability coverage, the good news is you already have it. If you have a homeowner's policy, a condo owner's policy, or a renter's policy, it's your liability coverage under Coverage E. It's normally written for $100,000, $300,000, or $500,000. It's going to pay for medical costs and judgments. Remember that your defense costs are outside the limits of the $100,000, $300,000, or $500,000. So your defense costs, if you're sued to defend yourself, the insurance company is going to pay for those, in addition to you also having $300,000 or $500,000 in coverage in most standard insurance forms. If you're sued for something fraudulent, baseless, or groundless, your personal liability coverage is going to provide for your defense. It's going to pay the defense cost to defend you. And remember that in high claim situations, like our example with the party, or the example the attorney told me about where teenagers were jumping off the roof into the pool, and the one teenager slipped and fell and was paralyzed. Remember, those are high-cost claims, so it is helpful to talk to your agent about personal umbrella coverage. You can get $1 million or $2 million or even more in coverage with a personal umbrella, and they are very cost-effective. It's just another way to give yourself more protection. Also, make sure to go over your personal liability exclusions with your agent. This goes to the dog bite and relates to the dog bite. So do review all of your exclusions with your agent. I hope this podcast was helpful. If you have a what-if situation for us, let us know at www.howinsuranceworks.co, and we may feature your question on the How Insurance Works podcast. For all our other social media links, you can visit howinsuranceworks.co. They are all up there. If you'd like to reach out to me personally or directly, you can always email me at mikemac@howinsuranceworks.co. That's mikemac@howinsuranceworks.co. Stay safe out there. Again, I hope this podcast was helpful, and we'll see you on the next one.